So now we're going to talk about narrative approaches to persuasion. And basically, this approach talks about and focuses on the very powerful influence, persuasive influence, that telling stories can have in terms of affecting what one thinks and how one feels about something and their behavior. It assumes that people are natural storytellers and that people make sense of the world through stories. In fact, how you make sense of the world in terms of your life, a lot of when if we were to ask about who you are and what it is you do and your like and your beliefs and experiences, a lot of what you may end up telling people are things that fall in the context of a story. Stories are inherently engaging to audiences because there's a plot, there are characters, there's some tension, then there's some resolution. And that's why, if I were to sit here and just only talk in like in lecture in class or something, only lecture about just what the research findings say about this theory or that theory or something like that, you would probably be much more engaged in what I was talking about if instead I put some of that in the form of a narrative, of a story that related to those particular ideas. They talk about Fisher's narrative paradigm. Well, I don't want us to talk about that much because I just don't find it terribly interesting. But I'd rather talk about another approach to persuasion as narratives that's not related to the narrative paradigm, but instead is related to entertainment education. And that's where we try to influence people through using stories or narratives in messages. This is often done in health promotion messages, but it can be done in any kind of messaging, political messaging, ad campaigns, and things like that. By entertaining an audience through a story, engaging them, you have a better chance perhaps of influencing them in the direction that you want them to go. So the idea with entertainment education is that by becoming involved in a story, if I'm listening to something, watching something, there's a story, and I become involved in that story, I'm likely to suspend attitudes and beliefs in the real world and instead become immersed in what the storyline is. And if I become immersed in what the storyline is and I suspend my normal beliefs and attitudes when I'm not in this story that I'm in right now, then I might be more amenable to being influenced with regard to certain messages because all my reality, the biases that I have in everyday life are no longer as strong as they are because of my engagement in the story. And so there are certain key concepts in entertainment education. And one is the idea of transportation. And transportation means we kind of leave the world we're in right now, like what you're doing when you're listening to this slide, and then you become more involved in this other reality that's in the form of a story. And what I would suggest there is just think about the things that you have really strong feelings about. Particularly things where you have a number of negative feelings or prejudices about. Are you prejudiced against people because of their religion? Are you prejudiced against people because of the groups that they belong to? Are you prejudiced against people or have negative feelings about people because they're here illegally or something like that? So the point is if you think about those, one of the things that I could do is I'm almost guarantee you that we could come up with a story representing the plight of some people or person within one of those particular categories. And it will become very engaging to you, and you will develop some degree of sympathy and understanding, at least appreciation for what their circumstances are. The reason why is you then suspend the reality that you're in most of the time and instead become wrapped up in their stories that are very human stories about very real people trying to get by day to day. So you can think of a number of examples like that, I'm sure. So how do we, how do we get influenced when we're in a story? Well, we get involved, we get involved, transport ourselves in the story. And one of the things that we can do is have some degree of involvement with the characters in which we kind of feel like we've got some connection to the character. And so the first one here is called identification with characters. And that's where one takes the role perspective of a character and thus suspends one's own identity. And so right here, there's a good example of a clip. I'm not going to show it on the video, but when you go in into the and look at just the PowerPoint slide itself, you can click on it and and watch it. Now, in that previous example above, I'll let you try to figure out in that YouTube clip, I'll let you try to figure out which is the person that I would like to identify with in that particular scene. By the way, if you haven't seen that movie, that's a really a good cult movie, and it's a lot of fun. It's very good. Okay, now wishful identification, and that's where one wants to be like that particular character. And it's not that you are, but you wish you could be because you admire that character, and thus they serve as a role model for some of the things you could be like and some of the things that you can do. And when you look at this YouTube clip right here, you can see that I perhaps have wishful identification with that character in two particular ways. And I'll let you work out which two those are. Then there's parasocial interaction, and that's where one believes that you actually have a relationship with the character. We think when that character is in that story and when they're acting or when they're talking and doing things, we feel like they're talking to us. And in this YouTube clip here, it's long, it's a whole episode, and you just need to focus on the first 4 minutes. But no one has ever been as good at parasocial interaction than that person right there. Just a true genius. And then finally, we have identification through similarity. That is, we think that that character is really similar to me. I'm a lot like that particular person. And in this particular clip, unfortunately, I find myself identifying with that character in a lot of ways, not all of them good. All right, so how does entertainment education influence? As I've said, it ends up, we suspend our own reality by transporting into this story. And what that does is it reduces our counter-arguing capacity. We suspend some of our beliefs when entering that narrative world, and that's all the arguments we might come up with when someone is saying something that we hold a position that we don't agree with, rather than immediately coming up with lots of arguments and things. By becoming immersed in that story, transported into that story, it reduces our counter-arguing capacity, and thus maybe some of our beliefs are more amenable to influence. It also may increase our self-efficacy. That is, building confidence in actions that we could take because we see a character we identify with, and we see that they're able to go out and do some good things and achieve something that they wanted to achieve. And thus that may give me some confidence that I too could be like that and try to do similar things and make those kinds of achievements. And thus the thing about education, entertainment education, that's a really important contrast and something that I might even ask on a test, is that entertainment education can interfere with rational processes, like, for example, that are talked about in the elaboration likelihood model. Remember, elaboration likelihood model, we're supposed to focus on the arguments, on the evidence, on the strength of the points being made, and then make a decision about that based upon our understanding and our rationality. By suspending our beliefs in the world, we get caught up into this alternative reality of this narrative, and then we then exist in that world, and thus maybe susceptible to influence with regard to what's going on there. The other thing, even though it's not mentioned on this slide, the other thing that entertainment education can do is it can also then go against some of the strong biases we may have that have been tapped into when we talked about social judgment theory. Remember, social judgment theory, if you had high ego involvement in something, you tend to kind of maybe have polarized views. Well, one of the things that narrative approaches to persuasion might be able to do is get you involved in a particular storyline, and thus it may weaken some of those those beliefs you hold very, very strongly. It may weaken some of those a bit, so it might make you a bit more amenable to influence. Just like we mentioned when we talked about social judgment theory, how credibility can kind of make you more, receptive to something a speaker might say. So too can a story if you get involved in identification with the characters.